All right. Looks like you have just entered my office, and my hope is to review what we've done in the first couple of weeks in Bible is History. This is the only time we're going to visit my office, and you can see why from the background. But the idea is then, starting next week, we will be in the chapel at Gansett Street Bible Church or Baptist Church, and we will have students with discussion questions, and it'll be for my students an opportunity. The live stream will be recorded because I have one student who can't come to class because she's in another class, and so she's going to join us at a later time. But we want to be able to hear the discussion with other students, and other students want a chance to review. I have a couple of students who have different learning issues, and this live stream will give them a chance to go back through anything, fast forward, rewind, pause, and remember what it is we talked about in class. So, Bible is History is a flipped classroom. I hope to communicate much of the content in short videos that are on the Basin and Towel channel and other places, and I give the students a link so that they can go there. But what we're going to do today is on our first week, we talked about the 12 basic stages in Bible history. These stages were developed by Harold Wilmington, and his book, besides Wilmington's Guide to the Bible, the previous um, part to that was called Basic Stages in the Book of Ages. And so, as a tribute to Dr. Wilmington, we will use those 12 stages. They're also really handy for studying history. And what I want to do with the students, just to remind you, is we're going to have a quiz for the next 3 weeks of class, in which first week will be, can you give me the 12 stages in order? So you'll have to memorize them. The second week is, can you give me the 12 stages in order and mention a person that is in each of those stages? And then the third week will be stages, people, and event. All right. So we're going to walk through those 12 stages right now. It's what we did in class. And so that will help to catch us up from week one. And then I'll give you a little bit of what we did in week two. And then you'll be caught up for what I hope is going to be the live class um, next Wednesday. How's that? So in class, we talked about Genesis 1 to 3. And my goal in talking about Genesis 1 to 3 was I had you do some homework that had to do with, what do we learn about the nature of God from Genesis 1 to 3? What do we learn about the nature of man? And what do we learn about the nature of the world, the setting in which God placed man? So those are the three topics that we wanted to pursue, and we tried to get some discussion going. One student said that one of the things that you learn about the nature of God in Genesis 1 to 3 is that he is a forgiving God. And this comes out of that third chapter in which human beings disobey God. They are subject to um, the curse, but they don't immediately die, and they are given clothing. Some animal died in order that the fur could be um, made into clothes and given to Adam and Eve. And that seemed to the student and to us as well that is incredible grace. Um, One student said we can learn from Genesis 1 to 3 that God is kind. And so I wanted him to flesh that out a little bit, but Jack did a good job. And the fact that God put him in a garden um, with such beauty, with such admirable um, things designed specifically for man. And we talked a little bit about things like, isn't it interesting that the food that we eat tastes good? What would be the purpose of evolving good tasting food? it's a benefit. We all have to eat food to live. But the fact that that is an enjoyable process is a gift from God. So is every colorful flower, every plant, every animal, everything that sits in the garden was a garden, for heaven's sake. And this is the setting in which God places man. So I had to agree with Jack that God is indeed kind. Answers I expected were things like God is creator, he is sovereign, he can speak things into existence. And certainly that's a part of the creation account. God is also one who desires fellowship. Now, one student said maybe God was lonely and that's why he was developing things. But I pointed out there's no lack in God, there's no need in God. Instead, there is incredible fullness. That God is a God who is rather more like a fountain. He's just always pouring out, and there's more and more to learn along the way. And so instead of loneliness, we said that God, in his fullness, because he has, we said, aseity, being within himself, but he pours that out, and he is blessing wherever that knowledge of him pours out. So that's kind of what we talked about with the nature of God. And then we went to the nature of man, and we talked about the fact that we are beings that are made in the image of God. Nothing else in the universe is made like that. And being made in the image of God, our job is to reflect the nature of God so that the rest of creation knows what God is like, in part by looking at us. Now that gets fulfilled in Christ, who is fully God and fully man, because everything we see God do is exactly what God would do. But you and I are created to reflect the character and nature of God as well. Unfortunately, since Genesis chapter 3, we are also fallen individuals. We don't live up to what we ought to live up to. We sin. We have committed, as R.C. Sproul said, we have committed cosmic treason. We have decided to go rogue, go independent from God, the God who made us, the God who knows best what it is we need and want and desire, and the God who, because he is overflowing, the God who can meet every need that we have, we choose to turn from that. What Isaiah says is the fountains of, Jeremiah. Can't remember now which one. We have abandoned the fountain of living water and we have hewn out cisterns. We made them broken and they don't hold water. So in Genesis 1 to 3, we have the nature of God, the nature of man, and then this world that he put us in. He chooses a garden. So it is ordered by God. All of the animals are made, all of the unique species, all of the unique plants, everything that Adam and Eve sees is good. And in fact, when we get to day 6 and the creation is completed, including the creation of man, God says it's very good. So that's what we have in Genesis 1 to 3. And then yesterday, at least, we took our first quiz over those basic stages. And so I wanted to kind of talk through those stages with you. And then we'll talk a little bit about the antediluvian world. All right, so the first thing is those 12 stages. Those stages from Dr. Wilmington that we'll be tracing through the whole course. This is the way we will remember history. These are the pegs that we can hang the knowledge that we learn on as we go through and we watch our mankind's walk with God develop, change, so that we learn more about God and we learn more about man in the process as well. So here are the 12 stages. First one is creation stage. It doesn't just include creation. In Dr. Wilmington's scheme, it goes through Genesis chapter 11, which means it includes also the flood and the Tower of Babel. All right. So the first stage we call the creation stage. It includes Adam and Eve. It includes Cain and Abel. It includes Noah, and it includes those builders of the Tower of Babel in Genesis 11. So those are some of the people that are included in the creation stage. And then the events include the flood, creation, the flood, the first murder in Cain and Abel, and then the building of the Tower of Babel. So those are sort of the events that go along the way. So when I ask you on week 3 to give me the first stage, the name of the stage, a person, and an event, you can memorize some of the names and the terms that I just gave you, and that'll get you through stage 1, the creation stage. Stage 2 is called the patriarchal stage, and that stage features one particular family line. It begins with Abraham, who will leave Ur the Chaldees and go into the promised land. He will go to a place that God shows him. The other patriarchs will be Abraham's son Isaac, Isaac's son Jacob, Jacob's 12 sons, including Joseph. And by the end of the patriarchal stage, Joseph and his family, now numbering 72 people, will leave Canaan and head down into Egypt until the famine is over. And as it turns out, the promise made to Abraham before is that they're going to be in Egypt. They're going to grow into a mighty nation, but they're going to be there for 400 years before God brings them out. All right. So that's stage 2. It's the patriarchal stage. So you could say the Joseph is one of the people. Anything that happens in the life of Jacob, anything that happens in the life of Isaac, that's the kind of thing that we'll be looking for. Anything in Abraham's life. The whole story of Abraham and Lot fits in this stage. The other thing that fits in the stage that I don't think we mentioned in class is the book of Job. So Job is actually a patriarch. We decide that because some of the language in the book of Job is old, and Job is offering sacrifices in case his children might have sinned. So that's what we have in the patriarchal stage. So those are the first 2 stages, creation stage and patriarchal stage. The third stage is the Exodus stage. So after the 400 years, instead of a group of 72 people, we have perhaps as many as 2 or 2.5 million people coming up out of Egypt and being led by Moses. So the third stage is the Exodus stage. Moses is the primary character, but you would also find Aaron, you would find Miriam, Pharaoh would be a character, Pharaoh's daughter would be a character. So all of those names would fit in the Exodus stage. And the events include, of course, the 10 plagues, the leading Passover, leading out the parting of the Red Sea, the wandering for 40 years in the desert, and then getting right to the brink of the promised land. That's where the Exodus stage will end. And the fourth stage, the conquest stage, will then begin. The conquest stage begins with crossing the Jordan River with Joshua, the new leader of God's people, and then going in and conquering Jericho, eventually Ai, the nations to the south, the nations to the north. So that will be the conquest stage, and it will end with the division of the land. So Joshua is a character. Some of the other leaders would also count as characters. My favorite one is, maybe because I'm old, is Caleb. Caleb never loses the vision. He's the one guy who spied out the land, saw it, wasted 40 years of his own life wandering in the desert when he knew where God wanted his people and how they had missed that opportunity. But he's allowed as part of the younger generation then to go into the land. And he asks right at the end of the conquest stage, he wants the mountain that is where the giants live, Kiriath Arba, because he wants to defeat the giants in such a way that every generation after that will remember that God is more powerful than the giants. All right. So those could be some of the events and some of the people that you could add to the conquest stage. So let's review. We've done creation stage, patriarchal stage, Exodus stage, conquest stage. The fifth stage is the judges stage. Things sort of after Joshua, after the generation that follows Joshua, the elders who are leading their tribes, after they die, there's a sort of spiritual malaise that settles in on the Jewish nation. And as a result, they tend to wander and worship other gods. And when they do that, they are taken captive and they are given over to punishment until they repent. And then God raises up a judge, a deliverer, who saves them. And then they are given a period of freedom. And then that whole cycle goes back around again. So some of the famous judges, my favorite one would be Ehud, the left-handed judge, because I'm left-handed. And then Deborah would be one, Barak would be one, Samson is one, Gideon is one. And if you know any of the stories of Samson or Gideon, things that happened to deliver Israel during the time of the judges, any of those events would count. All right. The next stage, then, at the end of the judges stage, the people are looking around and say they want a king. So the next stage is the United Kingdom stage. God gives them a king, first in Saul, and then in David. And then the apex of power for the Jewish nation is the kingdom of Solomon. So Saul begins to deliver God's people. David is anointed when Saul sins, and David, when he becomes king, he is able to build fortifications. He's able to extend their boundaries, and he starts putting together money so that one day they could build the temple. The building of the temple would be left to his son Solomon. Solomon, who is wise, David would write Psalms, many of the Psalms at least, and Solomon would write many of the Proverbs, and he would write Ecclesiastes, and he would write Song of Solomon. So he's the wisest man who ever lived, and he, except for Christ in the New Testament. So those are the three kings in the United Kingdom period. Even though there's a lot of sin, even by leadership, these three kings represent the high point in Jewish history. Solomon's son, though, is not so wise, and he splits the kingdom in half. 10 tribes go to the north, and they will never have a godly king after that. Judah is what they call the tribes that remain, to continue to hold on to the Davidic king and the promises of God. Some of those kings will be godly and some not, but the northern kingdom will never have a godly king. And eventually, when these two kingdoms are split, we call that the divided kingdom, or Harold Wilmington called it the chaotic kingdom. So that's the next period. There are many kings that you could describe. Some important ones would be Josiah, Joash, Hezekiah, Jehoiachin, Jehoiakim, Ahab. So any of those stories of good or of kings making the wrong decision, any story of Elijah, including Mount Carmel, any story of Elisha, even concerning the surrounding of Elisha with angels protecting So all of that could be your person and your event for the divided kingdom stage. All right. So we got creation, we got the patriarchs, we got the Exodus stage, we got the conquest stage, we've got the judges stage, then we've got the United Kingdom stage and the divided kingdom stage. The next stage after that, in 721 BC, the whole 10 tribes in the north are destroyed by Assyria and they are carried off into captivity. The southern kingdom lasts longer. It is finally finished in 586 with Nebuchadnezzar destroying Jerusalem and hauling off people exactly like Daniel and his three friends. His plan is to help them to learn um, Babylonian ways, to see the advantages, and to be able to build bridges then with Jewish leadership so that they don't ever rebel. That's the plan. Um, and Daniel and his three friends respond admirably to that challenge. Um, we call this the captivity stage. When Israel doesn't exist as a nation, it is hauled off into captivity, either someplace that when Assyria controlled it, or now with Babylon, they are hauled off into Babylon for a period of punishment of 70 years. So Daniel and his three friends work for characters. Nebuchadnezzar. Um, Events would include the fiery furnace, the dreams that Daniel interprets, Daniel in the lion's den. All of those would be good for what happens in the captivity period. The last stage in the Old Testament will be called the return stage. And what happens during this time, we've already talked about Assyria falling to Babylon. During Daniel's lifetime, Babylon will fall to Persia. And Persia, at the end of that 70 years, will make a decision to allow the Jewish people to go home. And so there will be some who stay, like Esther, and there will be some who return, like Ezra and Nehemiah. And they will go back and they'll build the walls of Jerusalem. They'll build the temple a second time, and they'll begin to try to rebuild what was lost. All the time having Persia as their suzerain nation. Under their protection, the Jewish people then will be allowed to rebuild. So that's the return stage. So all of those minor prophets, what do we want to say? All the way through Malachi would be part of the return stage. Okay, so those you should have 9 stages now, and we'll want you to give the name of the stage, a person that lived in that stage, and an event that happened. Okay. Now there are 3 stages. Then our final 3 stages. We said there are 12 stages. The other 3 are in the New Testament. One is the gospel stage, which is Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, and include all the stories that you know about Christ and about his disciples and training them, and then his teaching, his miracles, leading all the way to death on a cross and resurrection 3 days later. That's the gospel stage. All right. Then after that, we have the early church stage. The early church stage is essentially the book of Acts. So anything that happens in the life of Peter during that time or Paul during that time, you can read about them. That will be fodder for naming people and events in the early church stage. And then Dr. Wilmington grouped the rest of the New Testament in the epistles stage. And so the epistles, we have not just letters from Peter and letters from Paul, we have letters from James, Jude, Peter, and then we have some pastoral epistles, which are letters from Paul, but not to churches. They're instead to individuals, Timothy and Titus. All right, so those are our 12 stages. So during week 1, what we did is we just went through those stages and gave them to you. So now you can practice them, memorize them. I want you to memorize them because the last time I taught this, it took us a long time to get these stages nailed down. And I want to get them right at the beginning so that we'll have those tent pegs, those hooks to hang our knowledge on from here on out. Okay? Now we're going to go back to the first stage. The first stage is what we talked about last week. Yesterday, I should say. And just as I described, we talked about the nature of God, the nature of man, and the nature of the world in which God put man. And then I gave you some clues as to what early man would have done, what he looked like, how he behaved. So I said that man is made in the image of God and he's fallen. So there's a unique kind of dignity that comes to man. And there's an issue with men that we have to deal with that will ultimately and finally be dealt with by Christ. So what do we learn of other things that we learn about man from these first few chapters? The first thing is that man had a longer lifespan. I mean, you look at Methuselah, he lived for 969 years, according to the scriptures, which means he almost lived for a millennium. So that would be an incredible thing. Lots of people lived multiple hundreds of years, and they had, it says, many sons and daughters. And you can imagine if our whole lifetime was spread out like that, how God might bless our family, that it would appear to be a huge extended family by the time that we are done. So in what we're calling the antediluvian world, which means the world before the deluge, before the flood, and what it was like, learning a little bit about early man, because we want to show it in comparison and contrast maybe to our sense of mankind as Stone Age people with just skills at hunting and gathering and not much else. The way Scripture describes man's first business, we have the sons of Adam and Eve who already have established occupations. So one of them has understood farming and taking care of plants and producing a crop. And so all of that goes into that occupation of farming. And then the other one takes up shepherding and begins to understand livestock. And so one generation, we already have these occupations showing up almost immediately. And then we read in some of the genealogies in those first few chapters that there were occupations that were developing. One family line, it says, began to develop musical instruments. So even early then, we have the creation of music. We have the instruments in which we can play and sing. Another family line is described as these are the ones who dwell in tents and who take care of livestock. That's a bit like Abel that we mentioned. But then there were other ones who, like Enosh, it says he built a city. So we have already a distinction between where we need to live in tents to take care of our livestock and an urban center where things are bought and sold and where security is in times of trouble. So we have that already developing in the early world before the flood. Another developing occupation that shows up in the genealogies is one family line is they're forgers of bronze and iron. So they're already learning how to manipulate the material, the minerals in the soil to make things like pots and pans and weapons and plows. And so they are forgers of bronze and iron. This is the early world. This is before the fall. This is mankind learning how to, in the words of Genesis chapter 2, to take dominion over the rest of creation. They're using their minds, they're using their creativity to invent and to enhance what was already known, to build a better world. Problem is, because of that sin, we watch that early world with increasing corruption, to the point that we get to Genesis chapter 6. It says, the thoughts and intents of men's heart were only evil continually, which means we just went rogue, we went independent. And because of that, God stepped in to judge the world in the flood. And that's where we left off the class on Wednesday. We answered some questions about our upcoming field trip, and I'll get you that information online. But you got to check out the Kelsey Museum. Some of you have volleyball games, and that's great. Love the fact that you're involved in that. So maybe we'll figure out another way to get there. Otherwise, I'll give you instructions on how to go and what to see, because you'll love the Kelsey Museum. It's attached to the University of Michigan, and there are lots of things in there that are artifacts from Babylon, from Persia, or at least from the Mesopotamian area, and there's Egyptian and Roman things, Greek things. It's a great place to visit and get a good docent, and you'll have a nice visit. So there we are. We talked about that. So now I'm going to go to bonus content. You can tell I'm a total novice at doing things on the internet, but if it helps my students to get some of the concepts to be able to review or to be able to manage scheduling conflicts, I'm a happy camper. So here's my bonus content. Material we didn't cover in class that we probably now won't cover in class because we've got to move on to the flood, to the Tower of Babel. But here are 5 things that I wrote down that when we look at biblical chronology, these are 5 reasons that I believe there is a historical Adam. I don't know exactly how the time frame fits. If you ask me, apart from this class, what my timeline is, I would be a young Earth, 6 literal day creationist. But even if you're not, here are 5 reasons why Adam has to be a historical figure in my mind. So here's like 5 lines of evidence. First one is genetics and DNA coding. All the information in me is all the information that any of my children will ever get from me. So they have information encoded from my wife and from me, but if we don't have it, they're not getting it. Does that make sense? So Adam and Eve would have had genetic codes that coded for all mankind at this point. And then over time, different climates, different places, those genetic coding split out and created different ethnic groups. Sometimes the differences are cultural. Sometimes they might even be things like skin color and other genetic concerns. That said, no new information gets added into the human experience. One line of evidence for us all going back to 1 or 2, in this case, individuals. The second evidence, when we talk about the Garden of Eden and we read about the Garden of Eden in Scripture, it is geographically located. So we know where 2 of the rivers are, and we can speculate about where those other 2 might have been pre-flood. But we know Tigris and Euphrates for sure. And so we have an idea of where that general region would be. If this were a story of a myth, then what we have to do is in the myth usually starts out being much more fantastical. If we had a story of how Baal help to bring about creation, or maybe it's Marduk. We'll sort that out in a later um, pod, later video presentation. Um, but all right, so those are two of the things. The third one is when we read about the first day and the second day and the third day, it's all described by the phrase, and the evening and the morning was. So even if you tried to stretch the word yom in to include ages, you still have to deal with the morning and the evening because that sounds like a 24-hour day. Um, there's a movie you should check out maybe called Patterns of Genesis, and they have some historical language scholars on that who described the beginning of creation, and they said, you know what, it's historical narrative. Myth, poetry would be written in a different way. So that's a line of evidence for a historical Adam. Then I've got a few theological reasons. Number five. One is that we have to have a beginning point for sin. If sin is a basic part of our nature, then if there was never a time when man wasn't a sinner, there could never be a time in the future. The nature of who man is would have to change. So we have a beginning point for sin. We know where the infection began. And because of that, we can be fully human at the end when we are removed from even the very presence of sin. All right, so that's a beginning point for sin. And then B, death comes as a result of sin. So if there's not a historical Adam, there has just always been death. If death is a consequence of sin, then sin will have always been. So we have to have sin first and then death as a consequence. And then finally, in the account, how will we know what the nature of man is if we don't have those first three chapters describing the dignity of man, the sanctity of human life in Adam, in how he is made, what his purpose is in taking dominion? So those are some of the things that are mixed into the discussion of whether or not there was an actual historical Adam. All right, so study the stages, look for people and eventually events that are in those stages, and that's what we'll do in next week's. Our first live broadcast then on the screen will be next Wednesday, and we will start with the flood and the Tower of Babel, and then I hope to spend a little bit of time asking and showing you some of the evidences from archaeology of each of the stages. So when we do a stage, the last thing we'll do is some geography to show where these events took place, and some archaeology. Well, what do we know that we have found that relates somehow to give us a better understanding and a better glimpse of what is in that period? Okay, so you got the 12 stages. You got people, you got events. If you have forgotten something, you can always rewind this and play it some more. We've talked a little bit about creation and what you did for homework, and then what the antediluvian world might have looked like. And then the bonus content was there a historical Adam, and what makes his existence necessary? All right, so look for this next week, next Wednesday, and Gianna, I hope it's a help, and I look forward to someday meeting you. And for the rest of my students, I'll see you in a week, and talk to you soon.